Okay. Is there enough light here, you think?
It's okay. Perfect.
So, my name's Paul LaViolette. Astrophysicist, system scientist, and I've also worked in a number of other fields like geology, climatology, psychology, and ancient mythology. I'm an interdisciplinary scientist, so I work in many fields. My PhD is in system science. And actually, I went to get the PhD for the purpose of developing subquantum kinetics, this new theory I had developed. While actually I had started, the first paper I wrote on the theory was when I was in business school, taking a class in organizational psychology. And in the course, they were talking about general system theory, which I'd never heard of before. And I had been working for years on my own system theory. I didn't know anybody had developed such a thing. And here I found there was a whole society. There were scientists, they meet, have regular meetings. So from that, I made some discoveries. Also, there was the work of Prigogine at the time, Ilya Prigogine, and he was working on reaction diffusion systems, modeling them. And then there was a work that came out with the Belousov-Zhabotinsky reaction, which is a chemical wave reaction. And all of these together gave me the idea that about subquantum kinetics, which is a new approach. So I had been, with subquantum kinetics, it made a lot of predictions, astronomical, cosmological predictions, which I was checking out. And that's how I got into studying astronomy and made this discovery that here is something the astronomers don't realize, that this thing could explode and we could have an intense level of cosmic ray radiation hitting the planet. And that we're overdue for an event like this. You know, before they were thinking in terms of supernova, which are very rare in our area, or comets hitting the Earth, and nobody had ever thought about this, except, well, one scientist had suggested you could have outbursts of ultraviolet or gamma ray radiation, which could affect us. But it's more than just that; it's actual cosmic rays and so on. We can talk about that later.
For sure.
So the way I see now, after I developed the theory, it's very close to concepts that China has. The old concepts of the transmuting ether, the Tao, yin and yang.
Absolutely.
And in fact, after I developed it, I found that in the 19th century, Chinese scientists had proposed such a theory, very similar actually, before Lorentz and Mai had proposed their ether theories. Let me see, I can say the name of the fellow here.
Okay.
His name is Tan Su Tung. He lived from 1865 to 1898.
Right.
And he had an idea of matter based on a Neo-Confucian idea of a transmuting ether, mutually transmutation of yin and yang. So the ether would keep transmuting to the back around cyclically.
Right.
And fundamental particles of matter are formed through a condensation of this ether substance. So he was suggesting this way before we had computers, because to really show this physics, this ether physics, you need to simulate it on a computer. So he was way ahead of the pack. Too bad that it didn't develop further. So I came along in let's see, I had this idea around the 70s and around 73. And then, so I published, I developed the theory, published in General Systems journal, and then eventually as a book. And I published several papers in physics journals about this. The theory has had amazing results. It's made over 13 predictions, which have been verified.
That's absolutely amazing.
Relativity, for example, in general, has only made 4 predictions that were verified. And probably the reason why there's so many predictions is because subquantum kinetics, it's a unified field theory, and it touches in many areas. And in all those areas it has made predictions, it is successfully predicted. And right now, physics is in a bad state. It's going to crumble soon. The cracks have opened, and many physicists are dissatisfied. For example, with the Big Bang theory, that's the worst case. It's been disproven so many times in so many papers, and yet they keep sticking to it.
Right.
And there's so many others. So the way I see it in the future, they'll divide physics into the old physics and the new physics. The new physics will be subquantum kinetics.
Yes.
The old physics they should put in the history department. So people who are interested in the past ideas, and they can write papers on how the new physics is much better.
Right.
That's the way I see things developing. And the new physics will stick to their last dying breath. They're not going to let go. You know, they're going to fight with everything. They'll see that they're wrong, but they'll continue fighting.
Yep.
So I'm very happy that you have interest, and maybe you could interest people there to start doing work in this. There's a lot of work that needs to be done still.
Absolutely.
We have a group on Facebook called the Model G Vortical Motion Group, and we're trying to develop the spin characteristic of the particle in this ether theory,
Right.
Let me show you a few things, images.
Actually, Dr. Paul, just before you disclose even more details to us, basically, I wanted to just to elaborate a little bit in detail of what you're talking about in terms of subquantum kinetics, and also in connection of what you mentioned earlier about the Chinese researcher, whether he's let's say physicist or just old school natural scientist, because I think during the 1900s early, there's no such thing in China yet.
Right.
Scientist, right?
Right.
Okay, so basically, from my understanding, is that the yin and yang, the old traditional Chinese approach is basically more akin to wave theory rather than the particle aspect of it. And then because I think the particle is based on quantized notion of the wave form.
You're talking about what now? You're referring to subquantum kinetics at this point?
Yes, basically I'm relating to the subquantum kinetic to the more traditional approach of physics, and also to the Chinese approach. So basically Chinese approach, there's only the yin and yang, which is the duality of the energy. And then, but it does not really say whether it be a waveform or a particle form. Whereas traditional physics stated there are duality, which is the particle form and the waveform. But from my understanding, that the subquantum kinetics are more similar to the waveform, and then even though you do include the particle approach.
It's a particle that has wave characteristics embedded in it.
Right. So
there's no dualism. It's beautiful. I mean, there's no dualism. It resolves all those problems they're having, and it revises quantum mechanics. It makes quantum mechanics more believable. It puts it on conceptual ground.
Right. So what I was trying to basically state and clarify is that, from my understanding, is that basically the duality of the traditional quantum mechanics is basically not really coherently introducing the underlying nature of basically wave is what forms the particle. Would you say that is the more correct interpretation of the subquantum kinetics?
The wave? It's a soliton, basically. It's a wave that's localized. It doesn't propagate. It's stationary, and it's
standing
like
wave.
What Einstein would call bunched field.
Right.
It was at the time reading Einstein's paper, which he wrote in '54 in Scientific American, where he believed that particles were bunched fields. They weren't singularities, because he said that would ruin the continuity of space-time. So he didn't want that.
Absolutely.
But he was right with the bunched field concept, and the whole thing was we began with a brusellator, which I'll show, and that was a model developed in the field of chemical kinetics and in chemistry and non-equilibrium thermodynamics field by Prigogine and Lefebvre. They were doing the work in Brussels, and they ended up calling it the brusellator. And here, let me show a few pictures. So that's a picture of the wave pattern of the brusellator.
Right.
And this this extends throughout the reaction volume. It's not localized. Right. And the next picture shows the brusellator model. Do you see the chemical reaction species? It's not showing on my computer. your screen doesn't show, so I'm just guessing.
Right, but it is showing the second picture of Brusselator. 6B.
Yes, so that's the reaction system, the Brusselator reaction system that produces the pattern that you just saw through computer simulation. So they simulate this set of reactions and produce that.
Right.
And what I was working on is how to get that pattern to be localized, and it required a third variable. So with Brusselator, you have X and Y as to the two variables,
right.
but you need to add a third variable, and that was G.
Right.
And so what I was saying is, imagine that these reactions that they're describing chemical reactions, imagine these going on at the etheric level as etheric reactions, and these patterns are the particles that emerge. So the first slide here shows the transmuting ether that I was suggesting. And you see two ether transmutation processes starting A prime A and so on, going to omega and omega prime. And then you have the other B prime B, so on, going to Z, Z prime. And they intersect and react, and there's three variable ethers there. Mm-hmm. And those are what produce the physical universe.
Right.
And so the vector, this reaction flux defines a vector which is temporal in nature. Mm-hmm. In other words, if we're stationary there within the circle, all these things are transmuting through us. Mm-hmm. We experience this as time. Mm-hmm. Things change, so on.
Right.
If we were, let's say, one of these etherons continually transmuting, we would not experience time. We would just go with the flow.
Right.
So I was working on these equations. I went through various versions, and finally it came up with model G, which, by the way, the next one image shows the kinds of ether reactions that you could have. In A shows where three combine and it produces Y changes to X. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the second one is just a transmutation reaction.
Right.
Then the next slide shows the actual model G, and all I did is take the Brusselator model and I introduced a third variable G between A and X.
Right.
And what this does, G acts like G determines the fertility of the reaction system. So if G is lower than a certain level, the reaction system will become fertile and can produce the wave pattern. Mm-hmm. And if it's above that threshold, it's infertile and that wave pattern disappears. Mm-hmm. So by having a G well, so if the particle is able to create a G well, it's able to create a region in which it's stable, because a G well creates a fertile region which stabilizes the particle. Mm-hmm. And with this physics, it turns out that positively charged particles will create G wells, like what we call matter as opposed to antimatter, like neutrons and protons. Mm-hmm. These will create G wells. Electrons will not. And I'll explain later.
Mm-hmm.
So
it's a negative.
This is very much.
It's actually
like
basically anti-gravity effects of the electron.
Excuse me, you had a question.
Basically, when you mention G well, that's when matter is created, and then whereas electron is to produce levitating effects.
Yes, the electron is anti-gravitic. In a sense, it has negative mass in this physics, a negative gravitational mass in a sense. This was verified by Townsend Brown's work, the connection between electricity and gravitation.
Right.
It turns out that positive charges will create gravitational attraction and negative charges repulsion. And he was able to show this with his pendulum experiment.
Right.
Yeah, this is a phenomenon, electrogravitics it's called, is something that physics doesn't predict. But the US military has gone full force into this, and I believe the B-2 bomber uses the principle. I've written about this.
Right.
Made a lot of people angry. Actually, there's people in the military now, in the Air Force, they're interested in subquantum kinetics because it can help us build some of these anti-gravity vehicles. It's the only working theory that tell us how to do it.
Right.
You know, it's been slow moving, but the interest is picking up.
Beautiful.
So it's also, the concept's also similar to the Ankh from ancient Egypt. And I put here some letters to symbolize the ether states.
Yes,
And
I'm sure in the
see
screen.
a general similarity here. Okay, now the next slide shows the reaction steps. There's 5 reaction steps that define model G. The picture I'd showed before with the loops and so on, that's where I took all 5 equations and put them together visually so you could see what was happening. If you write them separately, it looks like this. And if you just write the partial differential equations to find out how the variables behave, you end up with 3 equations, G, X, and Y. So G is analogous to the gravitational field. X and Y create the electric field. And there's 2 states, one where positively charged particles will have Y above, Y will be high and X will be low. We can see that better in the next picture here. Okay, the next slide shows the electric potential. In the case of the left, we have a positively charged particle and the right negative. This shows the Y ether concentration. Now here in subquantum kinetics, we deal with etheron concentrations, similar to chemical concentrations.
Right.
So we have etherons that are reacting with each other, and the reaction rate depends on how much their concentration is. And they also diffuse, so both reaction and diffusion, and produce these structures. So the graph below shows a gravity field around for the proton, it dips down. For the electron on the right, or the negative proton, the antiproton, it goes up. And because of that, it creates a infertile region, and the antiprotons can't form by themselves on their own in space. They have to come from already existing particles, like a neutron that would decay to produce an electron, or experiments at CERN that produce antiprotons could produce a antiproton. For a period of time, it would be stable.
Would you say in between the X and Y is where the transmutation region is happening?
Let's see, X and Y on the previous slide with
the model G.
The loop reaction. You're talking about model G.
That's right.
You see in the diagram, model G diagram, A transmutes to G, transmutes to X, transmutes to omega.
Right.
And then here we have B comes in from upstream, from other state, reacts with X and produces Y and Z. Z leaves. Now the Y reacts with more X. You need 2X this time with the Y, and it generates 3X. So 2 of that X recycles, and you get an X.
I see. Okay.
And this is important because it's a nonlinear step. This,
This
in
is an
other
open
words,
system.
yes, this is an open system.
Mm-hmm.
And conventional physics believes the universe is closed system.
Right.
And that's why this is so much better. With this, we can explain free energy without a problem.
Absolutely.
Because in open system universe, it allows free energy.
Mm-hmm.
And even the table in front of you
Mm-hmm.
needs something to be maintaining it. And physicists don't realize that. They think that, you know, particles come into being, they just sit there and nothing else needs to be done to maintain them. Well, in subquantum kinetics, this ether flux has to be continually transmuting to maintain everything in reality,
Mm-hmm.
you know?
Mm-hmm.
And if it were to subside just a little bit, things would dematerialize.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Right.
So
would you say B and also the additional X's are basically what is bringing into this open system what conventional physics does not accept as the free energy?
well, how can we say this? It's just that you could say that there's this underlying flux of transmutation,
Mm-hmm.
and that's what animates our universe.
Mm-hmm.
And there are technologies that can, in a way, tap into that flux. And you can't call it energy. You know, energy is a physical
property
concept.
Mm-hmm.
But it's just that if you have something that it produces its own energy,
mm-hmm.
you shouldn't be worried and afraid like physicists are today. This thing is normal. You know, this is expected.
Right. It's constantly happening. It's would you say that's hyperdimensional? Not energy, but hyperdimensional elements that is interacting.
Here we're postulating 4 dimensions, 3 dimensions of space, and then a 4th dimension, which I call the transmutation or transformation dimension.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the one along which these reaction processes could be, you could plot these reaction processes in terms of as they go from one state to the next, they sort of form this dimension. So they sort of transmute into our physical universe and transmute out continually.
Right.
And we are sustained as a result. And ideally, in the future, we'll be able to model most of physical phenomena this way.
Right, Dr. Paul, this is a very interesting factor that you mentioned, that you can use computational methods to predict or to calculate or even manifest, let's say, a certain material. And then because I think also this can link us to the next topic, which is your study and research into Yi-Jing, the Book of Change. Because there's a Hungarian also system engineer, also back then it's called cybernetic engineer, and then he I forgot his name. I have to basically he's calculating a spherical model based on the hexagram. So most of the hexagram people see today is either a table of 8x8 hexagram, or the most advanced now we have in China so far as for public knowledge is basically a 2-dimensional circular diagram of the hexagram calculation. But the Hungarian cybernetic engineer, he came up in the late 90s a spherical 3D calculation model of the hexagram. So this basically opens up like a huge possibility for calculation. But basically, you know, before it's 2D and it's a finite, And then but his approach is 3D, which is infinite because it's constantly calculating based on a toroidal model of the transmuting hexagram. This is absolutely fascinating. If you're interested, I'm not sure if who you just mentioned now is the same person, but if it's not, then I'll send you a link.
Probably somebody else. Yeah.
Okay. But this is very interesting.
So I'd be interested to see what you have there.
Absolutely, because I read some article. I wrote an article based on the calculation for quantum computation methods. Because what you just said in terms of calculating a model for the transmutation of the Ethereum, I think it's pretty much the same as this spherical calculation of the transmutation of a hexagram. This is very, very interesting. I will definitely share this info right after.
I call it ether. Yeah. You can see that in the slide with the galaxies, the one where I show G wells. Within the galaxy, the space will be supercritical. And so that's why the galaxy will remain stable.
Right.
Outside, the G gravitational potential rises above the critical threshold, and space is subcritical. Right. So it turns out that light waves, when they travel in subcritical space, they lose energy. That's because they're damping. You know, in other words, the quantum is decreasing because the reactions can't maintain it. So it produces what we see as a cosmological redshift. Right. So that comes naturally out of the equations. It also offers a substitute for the Big Bang theory because you can see particles creating additional matter next to each other. So once let's say neutron emerges, it decays into a proton and electron, and then the proton acts as a fertile region because it has a G well, and it will produce, if a fluctuation, because the ether is always fluctuating, if you get a large enough fluctuation, eventually you're going to get one, it will create another particle right next to the proton, and that can either turn into a deuteron, or it could eject the neutron and form another particle. So you could now have two centers, and so on, and it becomes exponential growth.
Hence the open system.
Right, and so it turns out that all the astronomical data that they're finding is supporting the continuous creation model, not the Big Bang model. We see the size of galaxies have gotten larger and larger over time, and this is why. And ARP noticed that the cores, the quasars in the core of the galaxies, sometimes they would divide and send out a piece of the core, another core. And none of the scientists were willing to believe him. Instead of opening their eyes and seeing what he had to say, they kicked him out of Mount Palomar Observatory, and he had to go to Germany and continue his work there. But he was way ahead of everyone. He saw the reality. The others weren't willing, because that meant that the quasar was not a black hole. It was actually creating matter and energy on its own. And this is something that's predicted by subquantum kinetics.
Beautiful. So basically, there's two things now we can go into. First is that now science is becoming a religion, does not necessarily readily to accept what has been proven, or somebody provided some reasonable research and it's being neglected. Right.
Let me see if I have this other particle picture. So that's a result of simulation we did of a model G. Yeah. So now in fertile regions where the ether is supercritical, like within galaxies, on Earth, the solar system, energy waves will increase over time, increase the energy. So instead of cosmological redshift, you get cosmological blue, the opposite. And as a result, that means that heat capacity of a planet or of a star, in other words, you add up the total heat content of that body, will increase over time, just like money that you put in the bank and it's generating interest. And it turns out that it can explain the entire energy output from brown dwarfs and even red dwarfs. And here I had, to test that prediction, I plotted the mass luminosity relationship for red dwarfs. And this is accepted in physics and astronomy, that there is this relation. It's an exponential relation between mass and luminosity. And if you project it down, you find, this is what I did, I plotted the planets on the same line, because this is something that's an impossible thing in physics, because planets are supposed to not be generating nuclear energy. And it turns out they lay on the same line. So it means that the same process that produces the heat inside Jupiter, Saturn, Neptune, Uranus, which they know they have heat sources, is the same that's producing the heat in the red dwarfs. The sun, though, it's on a different, more steep relationship. It's called the upper main sequence. So that's due to the initiation of fusion. So fusion actually starts around when the star is around half a solar mass. Conventional physics thinks it happens when it's only about 7% of the sun's mass, but that's not true. It's where this relationship makes the bend. And the reason it makes the bend is because nuclear fusion is starting to take over. And but from there down, all that is pure genic energy. That's what I call it. Genic energy means it's spontaneously generated in the star. So I call this the planetary stellar mass luminosity relationship. And brown dwarfs lie on the same line.
What
so
you just What you just mentioned now is absolutely fascinating, because even though most people in the scientific community does not really give you, let's say, well-recognized recognition, but I think in the financial system, I think they're using your theory.
Well, yeah, I mean, you can make an analogy between the physics of subquantum kinetics and finance, because finance does recognize we have an open system. You can create money and you can draw money. So it's society is an open system. In fact, everything is an open system. It's just the physicists were the last to catch on to that. That's what system scientists study. They study about system theory, and that's what system theory tries to do, is show that everything essentially systems. It's just they have their own characteristics in each case, but there's a lot of similarities. And in all cases, we found the open system model is the best. And in fact, even business organizations used to use a closed system model, and then they went to open system model. General system theory made a transformation of the whole field. And so they view businesses like organisms that are interacting with their environment, with other organisms. There's a lot of similarities.
Absolutely
And so the future physicists will probably be studying biology first.
fascinating.
You know, it's natural. In fact, I do that in my book in Genesis of the Cosmos.
Mhm.
I present concepts from non-equilibrium thermodynamics, chemistry, biology, to get the idea of the open system.
Right.
And these are
La-
basic ideas you need.
right. Last
Excuse me?
December, yeah, last December, there's an article coming out from NASA investigation, but rather than just the reports, they're talking about they're finding all those amino acids elements in the plasmoids in between planets, right? Yeah, the energy plasmoids.
Yes.
Finding all those. Yeah. So it is a big organism. I totally agree. The whole universe is a big organism, intelligent organism, which can be leading to another subject you're researching in.
I I have a paper about prebiotic evolution,
Mhm.
the idea of how life could have gotten started by organic chemicals such as that coming to Earth or being created on the surface.
Right.
Um, you know, that was sort of just, I didn't do much more, just wrote that.
That's right.
Hello?
Hello, Dr. Bo. The connection is not very stable. We got cut off.
Yes. Um, and I was working on the theory in the program, the PhD program, and I made a discovery at that point about this astronomical phenomenon, where the core of our galaxy explodes, and that could affect us. In ancient traditions, even the yin and yang concept, I believe,
Beautiful.
is the leftover of ancient physics. It's actually better expressed in I haven't read all the books you have in Chinese, unfortunately.
Very interesting.
So
Though.
I have a limited understanding. Yeah, it's just I've read a few books, and that's where I got the information about yin and yang, but I'm sure there's a lot that's out there, and there may be a lot more detail, and that would be something very interesting for somebody to do a study on that, about this ancient physics, that they can come up with more than just the yin-yang transmutation. Has more been said about that. And I found it encoded in the Tarot, in the zodiac, the Western astrological zodiac,
Right.
and in the ancient creation myths, like the Egyptian myth of Atum, the Osirian myth, the story of Zeus, ancient Greek, the ancient Mesopotamian story of creation. And they were encoding the concepts, the universal principles, and representing them as gods, for example.
Mhm.
And the events in the myths were actually describing how the universe was created symbolically. But historians had missed this because they didn't have understanding of physics or subquantum kinetics.
Mhm.
And when I discovered this, I realized that somebody in the past had put this physics out in space in terms of constellations. They were trying to show this along the ecliptic. And right at the point where it was actually a cryptogram, it was encoded. So you had to rearrange the order of the signs in astrological zodiac to properly reflect the physics. The Tarot had the concepts in the proper order, so you could actually use the Tarot like a genetic code in a way to rearrange the signs to the proper order.
Mhm.
And when you do, you find that it gives you an indication that you got decoded the whole thing correctly.
Mhm.
They use the same techniques that we used in the Pioneer 10 message that we sent out.
Mhm.
For extraterrestrial communication.
Mhm.
So it's the idea of you encode the message and you have a key to unlock it. You also have a check mechanism to
Right.
make sure you understood it. And both of those features are encoded. It's brilliant work.
Mhm.
I mean, these were scientists of the past who were, way up there in intelligence state. Incredible.
Mhm. Would you say that they're polymath?
Yeah, you know, they can work as easily as artists, like Leonardo da Vinci, either artist or scientist, doesn't matter to them. They're extremely creative. So they were, in this message, they also included a warning about the explosion of our galactic core. And they gave the date that it happened in the past through a myth called, it's a story of Sagittarius shooting at the heart of the scorpion. And I noticed that the arrow trajectory of Sagittarius was shooting comes very close to the galactic center. And these two signs, Sagittarius and Scorpio, are in the message just at the point where energy is emerging. In other words, you're talking about the creation of the universe, and it's talking about the ether flux and so on. And then when you get to the part where the fluctuation emerges to create the particle or to create an energy or an explosive creation, that is symbolized by Scorpio and Sagittarius. And here they're pointing at it, and it turns out the pointer currently is off course because the stars have moved over time. So I figured, where were the stars in the past? And I arranged so the arrow would go right through the heart of the scorpion, which is the star Antares. And the arrow is a arrow of Sagittarius. And you find that happened in about 15,850 years ago, 65 years ago. About 15,900 altogether. That was, the sighting was accurate. And so I interpreted this as a date that the galactic core had exploded, because in a way they were indicating galactic core and gave this date with this arrow trajectory. So that at that point, I felt this was more important for my physics theory for the moment, because this something could kill everyone on the planet if it were be a big one, and we should know about this. So that became my dissertation topic at that point. And I put my physics theory on back burner, but I kept working. I was working on a lot of different things at the same time. So let me see. You saw the pictures I have of the arrow indicators and everything.
Yes, actually, I have your picture presentation, and I found a couple of others, not just couple, I found a lot of other picture references just to later add it into this presentation. Or through our email communication, I also mentioned that in the Chinese legend about the archer shooting down the sun, and then because right. And then for me, especially an honor and also a pleasure talking to you is that you understand the ancient record as being a scientific record, not only just the tale, also continue of what you just talking about in terms of the warning to us. So basically in the Chinese traditional history or story, the Hou Yi, this guy who's an archer that shot 9 suns out of the sky. And so out of the 10 suns, now we have only 1 left. And then so temperature is cooler and it's more suitable for life. So that entails that something before that is scorching the earth, and something dramatically happened. What happened to Hou Yi is that after he shot the 9 suns out of the sky, he was also in love with another goddess figure in China. His name, or her name, is Chang'e, which is a goddess that has a pet symbolized by rabbits. And then this, I don't know if you know where I'm going, but you will see in 1 minute.
Down the rabbit hole?
Down the rabbit hole, literally. So basically, this goddess pet rabbits is the constellation of Lepus, I think. And then because Lepus is right underneath Orion, and Orion is the archer, which I think is also personified by the guy who shut down the 9 suns. And then close to Orion and Lepus is K9, K9's major and minor, but so the major one is that contains the pulsar system, which leading back to your research of pulsar being the messaging system created to warn us about the galactic superwave.
Yeah, I was working, researching pulsars at the time I was developing the superwave theory. I at first studied them because I was researching subquantum kinetics, and I was getting into explaining variable stars and so on with this genic energy idea. And when I got to pulsars, it was the only thing I couldn't explain with my theory. It was very frustrating. No matter how I tried, they are so complex. There's no way. And even astronomers can't do it. You know, they've tried, and they all admit that we don't have models to explain pulsars consistently, you know, because every pulsar is different. And that's the thing. They make them different so that we understand they're artificial. You know, if they were all the same, you know, we figure, well, they're all natural. But each one is different, and they're precise. They're so precise we can set atomic clocks by some of them.
Right.
And they do strange things and so on. So what I noticed was the two closest supernova remnants to us, Crab remnant in the constellation of Taurus near there, right? It's actually between the horns of the bull in the Western zodiac. The bull actually symbolizes a superwave, a charging superwave, because you see that reference in ancient Chinese, ancient Egyptian mythology.
Right, the headdress.
And then the other supernova is the closest one to Earth. It's the Vela. It's only 800 light years away. And if you look at the timing, they put two of the most unusual pulsars to mark those two remnants. And in the case of the Vela pulsar, you can show it's not at the center of the remnant. So it's something that's superimposed. So the theories that these originate in explosions is not entirely correct. The dates of those explosions coincided with the date of the superwave that they were talking about in that message with the arrow. And so before I thought, well, they're talking about an explosion 23,000 light years away. But now I realize, well, this comes to us because here they're trying to tell us that this triggered this explosion, supernova, and then the next. And so those were important. Those parts were inputs were important to the development, to the conception of the theory, which then was tested with a number of ways through studying astronomy and gathering data. And it turned out all of what I found was supporting the theory, including the tests I carried out. First, maybe I should show that the theory predicts that the Earth will have these, in the past it's had high levels of cosmic radiation, and we know this by studying the level of beryllium-10 in the polar ice. And this graph I have shows going back 150,000 years, and those peaks below are beryllium-10. Beryllium-10 is created by cosmic rays in the atmosphere. It's a radioactive substance. So it's not from Earth. You know, it's something that it's an indicator of the cosmic radiation striking the Earth. And you notice that very tall peak around 42,000 years ago. That was one of the tallest events of this entire period. And Neanderthal man became extinct at that time. This event also caused the poles to reverse, the geomagnetic poles. And the magnetic field went to only 5% intensity at that time. So, you know, we're talking about something that has killed a whole species of man in the past. And the astronomical community is asleep. They still haven't woken up. You know, when they were looking at the galactic center, waiting for the G2 cloud to get spiraled in. They were hoping for an outburst. That was stupid. First of all, if there was an outburst, their satellites would have been destroyed. It wouldn't gotten any data. And whether they would be alive, they didn't know what was going on. You know, when this happens, and we are probably due for something in the next few years,
Oh, wow.
because of you're hearing. Now, you get this information in conspiracy theory websites and stuff like this, which is talking about the secret space program.
Right, right.
These people, there's secret projects. China has their own secret program. We have, they have found, they have this information. They're not telling anyone, right, because they don't want to, people get upset. They're not going to find out till the last minute, the way I see it. And I'm guessing something will happen of some sort in the next couple of years.
Actually, funny how you mentioned the, let's say, the recent developments. Beginning of this year, there's a lot of grounded fleets. The American fleets got grounded. I think this probably is due to the increased cosmic frying their instruments or interfering with their instruments. Possible, I don't know.
Maybe, I don't know. I haven't heard anything about cosmic radiation going up.
Right.
But who knows what's going on there in space. But in my view of this, we're still, the superwave hasn't arrived, and I don't know if that, what you're saying is related, but when it arrives, you'll see a bluish white light, star-like object in the sky where the galactic center is located. And the Hopis talked about this. And then it will, you see, everything will, it travels at the speed of light towards us. Essentially, cosmic ray electrons, the outburst from the galactic center initially produces both cosmic ray protons and electrons, but the protons travel slower because they're 2,000 times more massive. So the electrons sort of are at the forefront. And the protons end up slowing down so much that they get captured by magnetic fields in the galaxy, and then they just diffuse outwards. But the electrons form the shock wave that goes out. And we've seen this in other galaxies. I'm planning to write a paper, another review paper. I wrote one in '87, and the next paper will have a lot more data in it supporting this superwave theory. Right. So they arrive all together, and probably the first 3 days would be the most intense. We've seen a galactic core in another galaxy turn on, and the first 3 days were the most intense, and then it dropped after that by a factor of 10 or 100. Right. So probably a good idea, if it does happen, to stay underground for 3 days. Okay. If you can find a subway or something. And probably it's good to have a Geiger counter, but you could also use your eyes, because you can get blue flashes in your eyes if you're getting high energy cosmic rays. The astronauts report this. Right. So there will be hard times ahead, and the Starburst Foundation has all sorts of information on this. My books, Earth Under Fire. We did an international outreach back in '89 to warn governments about this, the UN, and we did get some positive response back from a few embassies and from a few UN reps. So, but I mean, if it seems that there's an awareness out there about the superwave, and it's sort of gotten out of hand, unfortunately, because the New Age groups have sort of taken the idea, and they're apparently in contact with some guy called Cobra, who doesn't identify himself, an ET, who's working with the resistance movement, who's supposed to liberate the planet. Now, it's possible that this is all true, but he doesn't always get it right when he talks about the superwave. He starts saying some things and they don't. I mean, it ends up confusing the whole thing. And, and a lot of people will start thinking, well, this is a crazy idea because it's just the people talking about aliens are talking about it. So this is a risk.
Yeah, this is very tricky since most people are also aware the false alien agenda. And then, so this is might very well be some sort of disinformation to discredit serious researchers like yourself. And then, but like you said, this could also be real.
I recently became aware of this problem of how this superwave theory, they don't mention my name, and they even use other words to describe it, like the event. So it's sort of like they push me off to the side and take over as if they know everything, and they don't. And so the people who are trying to find out, they can't get access to our research that explains things.
Disinformation.
And this is not good.
Yep.
So I made some postings and I'm trying to address this. I'll probably make a video, some appearances on shows and so on about this.
Right. So besides showing audiences in China about what we're talking about, I will also add this on YouTube when it's possible, and then also to give more credence to your research, and hopefully that helps. Because yeah, because I've been following your work for nearly a decade and more, and then so I know you're one of the first person that is start talking about this. But regardless, this is very interesting, and also. Yeah, talking about the cosmic rays and the certain phenomenon, I think it's not just limited to, well, when it's arriving, the first stage may be subtle as what you're mentioning, blue flashes in your eyes, but the subsequent cataclysm.
Yeah, so I can explain what would happen. What this does, when the cosmic ray electrons arrive, they get captured in the heliopause, the lower energy ones, and the higher energy ones go right through and strike the Earth, and create sort of a energy cloud around the solar system that ends up vaporizing cometary material. We have a lot of cometary material. We just don't see it because it's in particles like the size of a rice grain. You don't see it. But when this happens, all this stuff will get vaporized and create a nebula. So we will not see the stars. That will be one thing. Then the superwave will push this stuff in. This dust will get propelled because now it's become like a nebula, so it's able to be transported by the superwave cosmic rays. They end up pushing the stuff in. And it surrounds the sun. The sun draws it in also, and it forms a cloud around itself. The sun will become reddish looking, and this material will fall on the sun and aggravate it, and the sun will turn into a T Tauri star. As astronomers, they got everything backwards. They think T Tauri stars are stars that are being born. No, they're stars like the sun that had become surrounded by a cloud of dust. And what the dust does, the light from the star can't get out. It's reflected back onto the star. So the star heats up. It's the same principle of the light bulb. They make it so all the energy doesn't get out. The infrared is put back onto the filament, and only the bright light gets out. So as a result, the sun heats up and becomes more active. And it could actually nova and expel all this material from around itself. Or it could go into a state of continual flaring, making super flares. Not only the electric grid would go down if we got a real strong one, like the keratin event was a small event, and they're saying that if it happened today, our grid would go down. And a lot of other things. Destroy satellites. Cars maybe wouldn't start any longer. Fried electronics, and you could get an EMP. So besides that, it destroys the ozone layer, and so more radiation comes in. You've got a lot of UV. UV goes sky high from the sun.
Mm-hmm.
So you would want to be indoors during this. I have shown that an event, a solar event like this, is what killed off the large animals at the end of the Pleistocene era.
Mm-hmm.
I found the place in the ice core where the event occurred. I have a slide that shows that. This one with the radiocarbon excess, you can see from around 13,000 years for a 200-year period, radiocarbon on the surface of the Earth was going up and up and up.
Mm-hmm.
And the only explanation for that is the sun. The sun was more active. And you see these arrows here mark jumps where the radiocarbon jumped all at once 3 times, and they're spaced by the solar cycle period. So you conclude that these were solar events. And there's another one separated a couple hundred years, which was also very large, around 12,689 years ago.
And this is coinciding with the Younger Dryas events, would you say?
Yeah, this is what began the Younger Dryas. The cooling, you see, the Younger Dryas cooling happened in conjunction with this rise of radiocarbon. Why is that? It's because the radiocarbon was going up because solar cosmic rays were coming, striking the Earth, and they were creating cloud cover. They found, there's a scientist in Sweden, I think, he showed that at times of high cosmic ray radiation, we have more cloudiness. And so that will affect the climate. It will cause a cooling effect on climate.
I think right now we're already starting to experiencing some cooling, because right now it's already April. It feels rather chill compared to usual years.
But that's this is because the sun is cooling down. We're going to have global cooling pretty soon instead of global warming. We probably won't see many sunspots for the next couple cycles. And it could become like it was during the Little Ice Age. This is what they're thinking now. So global warming could become old history. And during an event like this, you're going to get additional cooling due to the cloudiness. To investigate at the extinction of the large mammals in North America, I looked at the Greenland ice core. Now I have a picture that shows this is data from Greenland ice, and you see right at this where the arrow is, you have an acidity peak. And the next picture, this is electrical conductivity in the ice skyrocketed. This was the highest of the entire Younger Dryas at this moment. So that's produced by the nitric oxides and so on that are formed by the cosmic rays. But nitrate, if you measure nitrate, it actually goes almost way down, almost to zero, right at the time. So why is that? And finally, I realized it's because UV radiation destroys nitrate in the ice. So this was destroyed by the UV radiation that was so strong that it would destroy the nitrates even as they were falling on the surface of the snow. So this is a signature. Every time you have one of these vents, you'll find a dip in nitrates.
Right. So just to also introduce a little bit more detail, if the cosmic radiation is getting closer and more exaggerated on planet Earth, there's going to be some dramatic plasma discharge events also?
On the surface, you mean?
Yeah, on the surface, viewing into the space.
Yeah, well, the cosmic rays you would see sort of luminous features around the Earth's magnetic field. because the magnetic field is capturing these, and it's going to be producing synchrotron radiation. It will be a bluish light.
Right.
So not only you won't see stars, but you'll see this bluish light with wave-like things. So it'll look a little weird coming from the direction of the galactic center in that direction. Like circular rings coming out as these hit, and going around. Just like we see going on in the Crab Nebula.
Right. The point I'm trying to make is that would this actually be linked with Anthony Peratt's plasma discharge research, or this is a separate?
Yes, it's what he's talking about. You would see phenomena like this, and he believed that the rock art drawings were ancient people trying to depict what they were seeing in the sky.
Right. The reason why I bring this point in is to give audience a little bit more visual. The Dogon tribe, which also, of course, talking about the pulsar, and then, but also one of their headdress is shaped like the figurine. Yeah,
and then there was the NASA scientist, Herbert Zook, who studied pits on lunar rocks, and he found there were solar flare tracks embedded in lunar rocks. And he had concluded that back in 1977 that the sun, the cosmic ray intensity of the sun had gone up 50 times. That was back around, about 12,000 years ago. It was 50 times higher and then dropped down.
This is all linked also, I think, back to the story we were just talking about, like the Chinese story is shooting down the sun. Dr. Paul, would you like to go a little bit further, or a little bit tired, or should we
I'll just finish up a few things on the other slides. So when this happens, it alters the climate. The sun's radiation shifts to the infrared because of the dust. And infrared radiation is more absorbed in the polar regions in the atmosphere. It doesn't get through the atmosphere very well. So in the polar regions, you have the greatest distance to go through the atmosphere. So you get the most absorption of this infrared in the polar regions, so they'll actually warm up, and you tend to get inversion conditions. So you can get very rapid snow hurricanes developing. And so you could go into an ice age very quickly with this phenomenon if it were to sustain itself. Depends on how long is the superwave going to last. As in the past, there's indication that we've had small events in the last 6,000 years. Have been about 12 small events, and they tend to last 1 or 2 years. The one 6,000 years ago lasted for maybe 20 years. It was more destructive. That's why Egyptian civilization, and probably Chinese too, began right after that, around 33 BC, 3300 BC.
A global recovery.
Yeah. And so it would alter the climate. The solar event, hopefully, the sun would be active as long as the dust was there until it was able to be expelled. So this could go on. I mean, it might not be just one solar event. Unless we get help from people they claim these spheres have come into our solar system, 100 spheres the size of Neptune, which apparently people have found them in the NASA SOHO feeds, and then they erase them because they don't want people to know about them. And what are these here for? They claim that they're going to help us avert the catastrophe somehow, create a shield. Now, we could do the same thing ourselves. We don't need to have our diapers changed by the extraterrestrials.
I agree.
Which is what it comes to. But it's the reason is because the scientists are not doing their job. I mean, we should have been on this a long time ago. And I wrote in my book, what we should do is set up transmitters on various planets to create a shield. We have the technology. It would be a phase conjugation technology. It was the same technology used to bring down the World Trade Center.
Just like
Instead
laser.
of stupid things like that with the technology, they should try to save people. I mean, these idiots there, I think it was the US government that did it to themselves, to be honest.
This is fascinating, you bringing into the phase conjugation and then basically a feedback loop. If possible, to do another interview with you regarding the electrogravitic and then also anti-gravitic.
Yeah, all of that's in my other book, in Secrets of Anti-Gravity Propulsion. Anyway, I hope these spheres are here to help us and not to take over the planet. This would be the ideal, during a superwave, the ideal time to take over a planet, because what could we do? You know?
That's true.
So, in addition, due to the sun heating up, you have what's called glacier waves. These are avalanches of ice water coming from the ice sheets. So during the Ice Age, we had, the poles were covered with ice. And what happens is during a super solar flare event, it heats up the surface so much that it's going to form lakes on the surface of the glacier. And we see this happening today. Recently, they've done with satellites, they've investigated Greenland. And during the summer, Greenland ice sheet is covered with lakes. And so I wrote a paper on this and published it. Actually, I hadn't published it until just recently, but it's described in my dissertation from back in '83.
Right.
It just took me that long to get around to publish, and demonstrated that during an event like this, it just took the data that showed the ice sheets were melting much more rapidly at certain periods, and that was due to the sun. And if you assume the melt rate goes up to that level that we saw was going, you have enormous number of lakes then on the surface, and you're able to produce these immense waves of water, which we couldn't do that today. You know, the ice sheets are not big enough. By the time they reach the edge, because we're talking about waves that start maybe 2.5 kilometers altitude and they're descending over 2,000 kilometer distance, and as they descend, they grow, they become longer and higher. They keep emptying lake after lake, and they keep getting larger and larger.
Right.
And until they reach the end of the ice sheet, edge of the ice sheet, and they're traveling maybe 200 miles per hour, 300 kilometers per hour. Right. They might be 300 meters high. And waves like this, which have started at 2.5 kilometer altitude, can surmount mountains. Even a 1.5 kilometer mountain could be surmounted. And you see the features, the flood features all around are evidence of this, including I've studied the lignite mine in the Megalopolis. And so as this wave comes, it will pulverize trees. The trees will already be carbonized from the sun, because the electrons from the sun, the cosmic ray electrons, will carbonize wood. And all this stuff gets crushed and pulverized and dumped in a valley. And that's what you have in Megalopolis, a valley that has lignite deposits. And I believe that's how these deposits were created, through the glacier waves, as I call them. And there's also what are known as Heinrich events, which were discovered by Heinrich. He found sediment out in the middle of the ocean that came from land. He suggested maybe icebergs somehow transported it. No, this is stuff that was carried by these glacier waves, because when they hit the ocean, they keep going. Now, the northern part of the Atlantic was covered with ice at that time. And so these glacier waves were able to skim over that ice and go way out into the Atlantic before they dump their debris. And that's nice, because they've got a whole chart of these glacier waves in the past, the history of glacier waves.
The records.
And the other thing is that the I ended up making a discovery of superconducting cosmic dust.
Mm-hmm.
The study I carried out to test the theory was to look for cosmic dust in polarized.
Mm-hmm.
And so this work I did at Portland State, sort of on a shoestring. We took ice samples from Greenland,
Mm-hmm.
or I did, and irradiated them in a reactor and did neutron activation analysis to look for iridium and nickel. And those are indicators of cosmic dust, since iridium is very rare on Earth, but you find it in cosmic material.
Mm-hmm.
And I found that iridium and nickel were very high. They were hundreds of times higher during the Ice Age than they are now.
Right.
And nobody wanted to believe me. I published the results. And one of the samples, the one that had some of the highest iridium, and it also had golds. I was the first one to discover gold in ice.
Mm-hmm.
It had a lot of tin and lead. Most of the sample was tin and a little lead. And so they claimed that I had contaminated my sample because they didn't believe that tin and lead could be in cosmic dust.
Right.
So for 30 years, it took me 30 years to publish these results. And finally, they were published because I demonstrated, number one, the tin had isotopic anomalies, which means it's extraterrestrial.
Mm-hmm.
Secondly, the tin and lead were in the ratio you find in interstellar space, not in the solar system, not on Earth, interstellar space.
Right.
Third, I took pictures of them with electron microscope, and you see they look just like cosmic dust particles, some of them. They're what are called the porous aggregate particles,
Right.
made of tiny nanoparticles.
Right.
And in fact, one of the particles was a single particle, 120 microns. I show it in the picture there.
Yeah, number 29.
Microns. And it's the longest particles yet discovered cosmic dust particle. It's a single mineral particle. That's all tin there. So there were quite a number. And also this dated from around 49,000 years ago, this event. And it was the largest cosmic dust incursion we've had in the last few 100,000 years. There was one that was larger, that was back around 350,000 years ago.
Right.
But this was the largest we've had in a long time. And you notice that one of the biggest solar events occurred just a few thousand years later, because all this cosmic dust had been brought into the solar system, and then it started aggravating the sun, and it went into that very high level activity that produced the extinction of the Neanderthals.
Right. That's
And
very close to us. Very recent history, basically.
It's interesting, the Egyptians had a calendar of kings, the Turin calendar of kings, that went back 42,000 years, BP. So it's as if they were recognizing that as their zero date for their kings. Very interesting.
Is that the same, similar dates to the Sumerian kings list also?
I don't know. I don't know about that.
I have to do a
Sumerian king.
comparison. Yeah, I have to do a comparison. That's very interesting indeed.
Oh, yeah, your professor will probably be interested in Tung, the fellow from the 19th century who started going along those lines. And so it sort of is a way to relate to something in the Chinese history. And that might get him interested to look into subquantum kinetics.
Yeah, I will try my best to also introduce you to the academic. But as I mentioned before in the email, the Chinese academic, they're relatively open to the older tradition because it is part of our culture, even though it has been damaged somewhat, but there is, like, in our life, it's still part of us.
The physics could catch on much quicker in China because you have that cultural background.
Right.
And so we're used to thinking about these things already.
Exactly. even though recently I did encounter some resistance from some academic, but I think there's always you know, the different groups, and then for example my professors, yeah, and serious people like yourself, and then there's others there's others that does really interesting and new things. So that's it.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Dr. Paul.
Nice talking with you too.
Okay, take care.